Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive.
It's great to be back.
Today I thought we could dive into some pretty interesting ideas from Kirsi Mäkinen.
Yeah.
And she talks a lot about this idea of the creator in us.
Oh, interesting.
So we've got a whole bunch of her writings and speeches, and we really want to unpack that idea. Why do we humans as a species, why are we so driven to build these models of personal development, societal development? What is it in us that wants to create these models?
Yeah, it's so fascinating, isn't it? Because when you think about it, these models, these frameworks, it's really how we try to make sense of ourselves and the world around us.
Right.
And they come from all sorts of places, right? Like you've got academic research, ancient wisdom traditions, independent thinkers. It really highlights that we have this drive to map out our own growth and journey as humans.
Yeah, and how to get better. And it's not always smooth sailing.
Right.
Mäkinen actually points out this sort of core tension that's in her work, which is that this amazing human capacity to create can be both really positive and constructive.
Yeah.
But it can also be, the opposite, right?
Yeah.
And one thing she does, which I find really interesting, is she highlights what she calls four-part models.
Okay.
And those are Ken Wilber's integral theory, Terry O'Fallon's stages model, Roman Anger's transcendental pluralism, and Nish Dubashi's diamond model.
Wow. Covering a lot of ground.
Yeah, she pulls from all over the place. And, she points out these folks, they all had these really profound, often personal experiences that led them to a deep understanding of this idea of non-duality, which we'll talk about more later. But, what's also interesting is that none of them were traditional university professors.
Yep.
And they all have these very unique stories about how their passion led them to create these models. So our mission today is to really understand what Mäkinen thinks about this creator in us, this paradox that's at the heart of why we make stuff and why we try to figure stuff out, and ultimately what it all means for, someone like you who's listening, who's always trying to learn new stuff and gain new perspectives.
It's almost like she's shining a light on this innate drive we have to figure things out, but also recognizing that there's this inherent complexity in that process.
Absolutely.
So where do we even begin to unpack this?
Well, let's start with this idea of what Mäkinen calls the paradox of creation.
Okay.
So what's really interesting here is that she points out that the people who are creating these developmental models, they are, after all, human beings.
Yeah, of course.
Right. And so they have their own blind spots. They have their own attachments, things they maybe don't see super clearly.
That's a really important point.
Right. So what she's saying is that no model can ever be the absolute truth.
Right.
It's going to be shaped by the creator's own perspective. And so she encourages us to be aware of that when we're learning from these models.
So it's almost like we need to approach them with a healthy dose of critical thinking.
Exactly.
Understanding that they're offering a perspective, not necessarily the definitive answer.
Right. And because these creators, they're on their own journeys of growth, right?
Mm-hmm.
She says it's really important that their models are clear and accessible, especially for those of us who are just kind of starting to wrap our heads around these ideas.
So a solid foundation is really crucial, especially for newcomers.
Exactly.
And I think this really connects with something that Mäkinen talks about, which is how, she says, life must be lived forward, but it can only be understood backward.
That's so true.
It's like we're always moving through life, experiencing things in real time, but it's only when we look back that we can really connect the dots, see the patterns, and understand the impact of our choices.
Yeah, and I think she calls this the mirroring mind, this ability to reflect back on our experiences and kind of learn from them.
Right.
Right. And it's like we've all had that moment where we think, oh, if only I knew then what I know now.
Absolutely.
If we could just go back and change those decisions.
But of course we can't.
No, we can't.
That's where the growth comes in, isn't it?
Exactly.
Reflecting on those experiences and seeing how they shaped us.
And sometimes that reflection brings up these feelings of regret.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Right. Or guilt, where we're like, oh, I should have done things differently, or I wish I had seen things more clearly at the time.
Yeah. I think we all carry that baggage to some extent.
For sure.
But Mäkinen actually offers this really empowering perspective. She suggests that just because we've maybe fallen into these unhelpful patterns in the past, it doesn't mean we're doomed to repeat them forever.
Right.
We all carry this old stuff around with us, right?
Yeah.
These beliefs and behaviors that we've picked up from our families, our environment,
workplaces,
interest groups, all of these things. And, sometimes they may not actually even reflect who we truly are or what we believe anymore.
That's so true. So she's really highlighting the importance of self-awareness and recognizing that those patterns might not serve us anymore.
It's like we have the power to break free from those limitations,
Exactly.
to consciously choose a different path.
But this brings us to maybe a slightly less comfortable aspect of this creator capacity.
Okay.
Makinen argues that this human drive to create has in many ways led to the societies that we have built.
Yeah.
And she points out that a lot of these foundational structures that we've created, they're actually starting to show some serious cracks.
That's a pretty sobering thought.
It is.
So if these structures that we've built are facing breakdown, how does Makinen see that actually playing out in the world?
Well, one of the interesting contrasts she draws is between our huge outward achievements, like landing on the moon, right? And then on the other hand, this kind of lack of acceptance of our shared humanity and our interconnectedness.
So it's like we've made all this progress externally,
Yeah,
but maybe haven't kept up with the internal work,
exactly.
the inner transformation.
And she argues that real change needs to begin with like a fundamental shift within each of us, in our own higher mind, in our consciousness.
So it's like that individual evolution and perspective
Exactly.
that ultimately leads to a collective shift.
Right, because if we're not evolving internally, then the structures we create are just going to reflect those same limitations.
And those blind spots that we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Makinen says that they often prevent us from seeing what we're really, kind of trapped by or had by.
Right.
Until we've moved beyond it.
Right. It's like we're walking through a fog, and we can only see clearly once the fog has lifted.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And then she goes on to give this pretty direct critique of what she calls the concrete patriarchal authority basis.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and she links it to this fear of losing control, to this kind of heightened individualism.
Okay.
And this belief that we somehow know it all. And this is often, she says, justified by science.
Interesting.
Right. But without actually taking personal responsibility for our own feelings, thoughts, and actions.
So it's like clinging to these external structures and explanations.
Exactly.
Without acknowledging the inner landscape.
Yeah.
But, isn't there some value to established structures and science? Where does she draw the line between, those frameworks and the ones that become limiting?
I think what she's getting at is not to throw out structures or science entirely,
Right.
but to be mindful of when those become too rigid and they prevent us from acknowledging those inner aspects of ourselves, like our emotions, our intuition, and our interconnectedness. She even uses the term predator to describe this unhealthy side of what she calls the assumed ruler in this mind.
Oh, wow.
Right, so this is that part of us that wants to dominate, wants to control, often out of fear.
So it's like this shadow aspect that can get amplified when we're too attached to external structures.
Right. And what she's really concerned about is how this can even show up in people who are like further along on their personal development journeys.
Like people who are already pretty self-aware.
Yeah, like later stage practitioners, let's say.
Yeah.
She says they might end up serving these kind of ego-led organizations
Okay.
without considering the broader implications of their action, like how those organizations might be impacting their employees, their communities, the environment.
So it's like they might have good intentions, but they're still caught in this system
Exactly.
that perpetuates some of these harmful patterns.
Yeah. And this ties into how she views limited companies.
Okay.
So she sees them as a manifestation of this same kind of mindset.
Of this individualism.
Yeah, like this system that's designed to maximize profit, but maybe it distances people from taking responsibility for the potential negative outcomes.
It's like this disconnect between actions and consequences.
Yeah, and it's all rooted in this underlying belief in separation. So if we like zoom out and look at the bigger picture, what do you think is the core issue that Makinen is pointing to here?
I think it all comes back to this problem of othering.
Yeah.
Right. It's like this old mindset of separation and control that creates these hierarchies and boundaries between us and them.
Right. And she's really emphasizing the importance of valuing what the other side, the other perspective can teach us.
Even if it's challenging or uncomfortable.
Yeah, even if it's scary.
Right. Because it's often in those differences that we find the most valuable insights.
Exactly.
And I think she makes a really important distinction here.
Yeah.
Between genuinely recognizing and integrating the insights from the other and simply trying to exploit or take advantage of them for our own gain.
Right.
It's about true understanding and respect, not manipulation.
And she actually connects this to embracing the authentic parts of ourselves.
What do you mean by that?
like the parts that we might have rejected or ignored, those aspects of our true self.
Oh, I see.
Yeah.
So it's about valuing the other, both within and outside of ourselves.
Exactly. Now, for those of you who are like actively working with these developmental models, Mackinnon makes it pretty clear that it's not a passive process.
Like, it's not just about reading a book and calling it a day.
No, it's a pretty demanding journey.
Okay.
And she says that it requires growth in 3 main areas. Growing up, which is about emotional maturity.
Okay.
Cleaning up, which is about addressing those past traumas and limiting beliefs.
Uh-huh.
And then waking up, which is about deeper spiritual understanding and awakening to our true nature.
So it's a pretty holistic approach,
It is.
addressing all those different levels of ourselves.
And what's really fascinating is the level of self-inquiry that's required.
Oh, I bet.
She mentions practices like shadow work, which is about exploring those parts of ourselves that we tend to reject or deny.
Yeah.
Dream work.
Wow.
And all sorts of different forms of meditation.
So really diving deep into our own inner landscape.
Yeah. And she really emphasizes that this takes time, it takes effort, and it takes this willingness to really question everything we think we know.
So it's not for the faint of heart.
It's not.
But it sounds like the rewards can be pretty transformative.
Oh, absolutely. She says it can lead to becoming what she calls a conscious creator.
Wow.
Someone who's actively shaping their reality from a place of greater awareness.
So it's like we become more intentional in our choices and actions.
Exactly. And along the way, there's this fundamental shift that occurs.
Okay.
It's a move away from seeing the world as this collection of separate, isolated things and towards recognizing everything as interconnected and part of a larger whole.
So it's like a shift from a fragmented view to a more unified one.
Exactly.
And I think this really connects with what Mackinnon talks about in terms of those limited dualistic perspectives.
Oh, yeah.
You know, the either thinking.
Right.
She says that it really restricts the potential of human consciousness.
And so the key here is learning to distinguish between our own projections.
But projections.
Yeah, like those feelings or beliefs that we unconsciously put onto other people.
Okay.
And then also our introjections.
Interjections.
So those are the beliefs or values that we have unconsciously absorbed from our environment.
I see.
So once we can kind of tease those apart, then we can start to see ourselves more clearly.
Without those filters distorting our view.
Exactly.
And what does she call that process?
She refers to it as the beginning of meta-aware evolution.
A meta-aware evolution.
Yeah, so it's like this conscious awareness that goes beyond the limitations of just our rational mind.
So it's like tapping into a higher level of understanding.
Yeah, and she believes that by actively healing those past traumas and integrating our shadow selves, we can create systems that genuinely serve the well-being of everyone.
So it's like this individual healing that leads to collective transformation.
Exactly, and she describes this as evolving into this space where we're all both teachers and students.
I love that.
Right. Like we're all learning from each other and supporting each other's growth.
It's like this beautiful interconnected web of learning and evolution.
It is.
And where does individualism fit into all of this?
Well, she talks about this kind of upgraded version of individualism.
Okay.
So it's not about rejecting our individuality.
Right.
But it's about incorporating this deep awareness and understanding of the other side.
So it's like this more holistic and inclusive form of individualism.
Exactly. And when it comes to how we learn and grow, Mackinnon points out that we often gravitate towards teachers and sources that kind of match our existing conditioning.
Like we seek out information that confirms our beliefs.
Yeah, like our habits of belief.
Okay.
And she really emphasizes that this whole journey of learning and development, it's really about self-discovery.
Like uncovering those layers of identity and beliefs that we've accumulated over time.
Exactly.
It's not just about gaining knowledge for the sake of knowledge.
Right. It's about this deep inner transformation.
So it's more about the process than the destination.
Yeah, and she stresses that this requires consistent practice and dedication.
Okay.
Without necessarily having this specific end goal in mind.
So it's about the journey itself, not just achieving a certain outcome.
Exactly.
And what about things like external rewards or financial gain? Where do those fit in?
Well, she says that the focus should really be on uncovering those deeper universal truths that resonate within us.
So it's about connecting with something larger than ourselves.
Yeah. And she talks about this idea of turning inward, of becoming our own philosopher.
Like becoming our own source of wisdom.
Exactly.
And our own subject of meditation.
Yeah.
So it's about cultivating this inner awareness.
Uh-huh. And this is in stark contrast to how a lot of us operate in the modern world.
How so?
Well, we tend to seek fulfillment and validation from external sources.
Oh, yeah, I see that all the time.
Right, like from achievements, from possessions,
Yeah.
from other people's approval.
It's like we're constantly looking outside of ourselves for something that can only be found within.
Exactly. And as we deepen this inner work, Megan explains that we start to trust our own inner knowing more.
Okay.
That inherent wisdom that we all have access to.
So it's like we're reclaiming our own authority.
Yeah, and it becomes more important than needing external validation.
That's powerful.
It is.
And what about knowledge itself? How do we actually achieve true understanding?
Well, she makes this really important distinction between intellectual understanding
Okay.
and deep self-inquiry.
So it's not just about knowing the facts.
Right. It's about embodying that knowledge and integrating it into our being.
So it's like taking that information and making it our own.
Exactly.
Internalizing it.
Yeah. And she points out that the mind often gets stuck in what she calls the finite game.
The finite game.
Yeah, which is this constant pursuit of external validation and measurable achievement.
So it's like we're always trying to win.
Yeah. Or prove ourselves.
No.
But the real breakthrough, she says, comes when we understand this process of closing loops.
What does she mean by closing loops?
Well, she sees consciousness as inherently creative,
Okay.
right? And it's always striving for completeness. So it makes us aware of what's missing or what's unresolved in our experience.
So it's like this innate drive to find wholeness.
Yeah, to make things whole. And in this context, how do you think she defines consciousness itself?
Well, based on what you've said, it sounds like she sees consciousness as this dynamic force that's constantly shaping and being shaped by our experiences.
Exactly. And she calls it our higher mind, which is constantly being refined by our stage of development.
Our stage of development.
Yeah, by how much we've healed our wounds and how integrated we've become.
So it's like our level of consciousness is directly related to our level of healing and wholeness.
Exactly.
And you mentioned earlier this shift that occurs when our awareness itself becomes the focal point,
Yeah.
the ultimate object of our knowing.
Right. So instead of just using our awareness to perceive objects, our awareness becomes the object itself.
Wow, that's a mind-bending concept.
Yeah,
Because what does that lead to?
Well, she says it leads to this profound sense of wholeness and a deep connection to what we often call spirit.
So it's like a spiritual awakening.
It is.
And it all stems from this shift in how we understand and experience our own awareness.
Exactly. And then Meikonen offers this really interesting definition of you, of what it means to be you.
Okay, I'm curious.
She says that you are both the creator awareness, which is like this eternal, infinite, awakened action that's the source of everything, and you're also the creation itself.
So we're both the creator and the created.
Yeah, like this constant interplay between the two.
That's deep.
It is. And so she's saying that for humanity to evolve to this new level of collective consciousness, this creator part of us needs to go beyond just understanding universal truths.
Okay.
We have to actually integrate our shadow selves, believe in the creative process, and allow new forms of consciousness to emerge through us.
So it's about actively participating in our own evolution.
Exactly. Now, finally, she talks about the meaning and significance of mental models themselves.
Okay.
And she says that these models are essentially reflections of their creator's level of awareness, their values, and what they find meaningful.
So the models themselves reveal something about the people who created them.
Yeah, and she points out that we all have our own versions of these mental models.
Even if we haven't consciously articulated them.
Right.
It's like we're all creating our own maps of reality.
Exactly. And she highlights the models created by those folks we mentioned earlier, like Wilber and O'Fallon.
Yeah.
And she says that they can function as these completion loops.
Magical loops.
Yeah, like they offer these frameworks that can guide us towards this state of unity that's been recognized by spiritual traditions for centuries.
So they're like signposts pointing us towards that ultimate state of being.
Exactly.
And you mentioned Terry O'Fallon's stages model earlier.
Yeah.
What are some of the key insights from that model?
Well, she talks about these collective shifts in consciousness that happen at different stages, particularly in how we understand the other and how we move beyond those unhealthy dependencies.
So it's like we're evolving as a species in terms of how we relate to each other and ourselves.
Exactly.
And what about this idea of becoming aware of our societal conditioning?
Yeah, she says that's a crucial part of realizing our own authentic sovereign nature.
So it's about recognizing the ways in which we've been shaped by our culture and then choosing to break free from those limitations
Exactly.
and embracing our own unique individuality.
Yeah. And she proposes that the purpose of this whole third dimension, this physical reality that we're in,
Huh?
is to evolve our minds to a point where we can use higher wisdom for the benefit of all.
So it's like we're here to learn and grow,
Yeah.
to evolve our consciousness.
And to understand that true transcendence means letting go of our attachments.
Letting go of our attachments.
Yeah, like our clinging to certain beliefs, identities, or material possessions.
So it's about freedom from those limitations.
Exactly.
And she emphasizes that this unfolding of awareness is a continuous process,
It is.
and that through deep inner inquiry, we can awaken to our potential as creators, as goddesses in our own lives.
Yeah, and she even draws these parallels to the Christian Holy Trinity
Oh,
and this idea of triple loop learning.
triple loop learning.
Yeah, where we not only learn and adapt, but we also question our underlying assumptions and beliefs.
So it's like we're constantly evolving and refining our understanding.
Exactly.
It sounds like a pretty profound journey.
It is. So as we wrap up this deep dive, it's clear that engaging with these models isn't just about gaining knowledge.
Right.
It's about transforming our consciousness.
It's about embodying that knowledge and making it a part of who we are.
Exactly. And it requires that deep inner exploration, that commitment to self-reflection.
And the willingness to challenge our own beliefs.
Yeah, but the potential reward is huge.
It is. It's like expanding our vision of ourselves and the world
Yeah.
and tapping into our own creative power to shape our reality.
And ultimately, Mikkonen says, by understanding our own internal versions of the stories we've inherited,
Okay.
and by awakening to those realizations of the people who created these models, we come to a deeper understanding of ourselves as both the creator and the created.
That's beautiful.
It is. So I'll leave you with this final thought from Mikkonen.
Okay.
She says that humanity is still trying to figure out its relationship with others and otherness.
That's a big one.
It is. And she says that our fears can so easily lead us to create the very limitations that we're trying to escape.
So it's like we're our own worst enemy in some ways.
In some ways, yeah.
And for those of you who want to keep exploring these ideas, we'll be doing more deep dives into specific four-part models in the future.
Yeah, like astrology, gene keys, human design,
Oh, cool.
Jungian alchemy. And we'll look at the differences between models that emphasize time and evolution
Okay.
and those that focus on the timeless aspect of our being.
I'm looking forward to that.
So here's a question for you to ponder as you go about your day.
Okay.
What is your own evolving relationship with that inner creator that you have inside of you? And how are you actively engaging with the otherness that shows up in your life?
That's a lot to think about.
It is. Thanks for diving deep with us.
My pleasure.
Until next time.
See you then.